Alright, so how healers feel in Mythic Plus. This is with the second iteration of Thundering that gives you the positive and negative buff. Most of this testing was done in Alcathar Academy for Ruby Life Pools, and that's because Azure Vaults is just cancer. I don't want to be there. A million AoE effects, ground effects, spell vomit everywhere, anti-melee mechanics. It's just not a fun dungeon at the moment. So I stuck to the other two dungeons that were available. On the whole, I found Alcathar Academy significantly easier than Ruby Life Pools, but that's mostly because Ruby Life Pools has more mechanics and more difficult bosses by far than Academy. I tested everything just to begin with on just a 10, 11 or 12 key with only Thundering. I think a couple of them might have had Fortified as well, but no major Mythic Plus mechanics other than Thundering. And to start off, we'll look at Preservation. Throughput on Preservation is quite high. The AoE healing you can pump out, the burst healing you can pump out is really quite good. Single target kind of spot healing can be a little bit lacking. I didn't feel like mobility was much of an issue, or at least not as much of one as I thought there would be. I feel like that's mostly because in especially the two dungeons that I've been testing this week, groups are generally stacked quite close together, and I think Thundering plays quite a role in that, because a lot of people will get the Thundering debuffs on them and then they will stay loosely around whoever has the opposite debuff. So groups tend to stay clumped. You don't get, one warlock 40 yards away and everybody else stacked on the boss. Everyone stays roughly clumped together, which makes playing Preservation really not feel that bad at all, mobility wise. Defensive wise, Preservation is absolutely horrid. A simple armor buff from Obsidian Scales and a 20% magic DR, it just isn't comparable to what other defensives other classes have. The one kind of saving grace for me at the moment with Preservation is, it turns out, I didn't know this until I tested it this weekend, but it turns out the mastery that Preservation has, it reads that healing done to allies is increased by whatever the percentage of your mastery, while their health percentage is lower than your own. Now, the interesting thing here is that any healing you do on yourself gets the full effect of mastery bonus. And I have found that using Verdant Embrace, which again reads fly to an ally and heal them for, I think it's 306% spell power healing, which for an ability that's on a, I think 18-second cooldown base, is really quite a huge heal. You can use this on yourself, and that's largely what I've been doing, especially in Ruby Life Pools. There are quite a few personal AoE effects in Ruby Life Pools, like trash mobs will place a debuff on you after X amount of seconds, you take damage and fly up in the air, and there's a, 6-yard radius or range around you or something, and anyone else in that AoE will also take the damage and fly up in the air. So there's quite a few like small spread mechanics, which makes using something like Verdant Embrace just feel horrible. There's also quite a few frontal cleaves from trash, so, flying to the tank to eat a frontal cone or something feels horrible. So I've actually just been using Verdant Embrace for the most part as a personal defensive, a pseudo-defensive. And with the full mastery effect on a 300-ish% spell power heal, that, by the way, with Lifebind, you can also increase that by 40% of the heal on yourself again. It's really quite a strong heal. You can almost, if you crit with your Verdant Embrace, you can top yourself no matter what. So that's been quite handy. It sucks that I can't really use it for movement, but it has helped a lot in staying alive in situations where all the other classes can press a defensive and live, and Evoker just can't. I wish Renewing Blaze was better. The problem is the duration. So healing for 100% of the damage done over 14 seconds sounds great until you realize that if you die over a 2-second window or a 3-second window, like what often happens when everyone's pressing a defensive cooldown, let's say, for the sake of argument, to make the calculation a little bit easier, let's say you take 100% of your damage, of your health as damage, and you drop from 100% to death, or 3 seconds. Pressing Renewing Blaze will only heal you for 20% of your health over that time, over a 3-second death, which, to put that in perspective, if you're taking 33% of your health as damage per second, Pressing Renewing Blaze is going to buy you half of a global. It just isn't a strong cooldown as a defensive. It's great for prolonged damage. It's great when you already have someone healing you and you take multiple times your health as damage over a few seconds. But for short bursty incoming damage, it's horrible. Damage on Preservation feels okay. It doesn't feel particularly great. I mean, it's competitive. It doesn't really stand out above the rest. The nice part about it is that you can get away with doing somewhat reasonable damage by pressing one damage button every 30 seconds. That's it. Reversion proccing the instant Living Flame from the tier set bonus feels really good. It made spot healing feel almost top tier because it procs so often and I could sit on the buff for quite a while. I found myself leaning quite heavily on Spirit Bloom in a lot of encounters, the last boss in Ruby Life Pools in particular, because something like Dream Breath requires me to have good positioning, which on a lot of boss fights, especially in pugged content situations where you can't really coordinate with your tank or your tank might not have the best positioning, oftentimes I can't be in a good position to hit the group with something like Dream Breath, so I rely on Spirit Bloom instead. At the moment in plus 10s, that didn't feel like too much of a handicap. And overall, I think I would say that at least at the moment, it feels like Preservation is almost one good defensive away from being quite competitive, in Mythic Plus at least. Its triage healing or spot healing could use a little bit of work, but at the end of the day, I feel like it makes up for that with very good stacked AoE healing. There were times like the Thunder caster guys in the end of Ruby Life Pools that do a pulsing AoE party-wide damage. I found that on Preservation, I could almost easily, without committing cooldowns, I could burst 50, 60k HPS to keep my group alive, which out of all the healers I've played this weekend, that is by far the highest stacked AoE throughput, especially when I'm not committing cooldowns. Most other healers I've played would be working quite hard to do 30 in that scenario and probably struggling to do 40. And Preservation can just sit there pumping 50 without really committing much. As far as Discipline Priest goes, overall the gameplay for Disc felt really quite good. Atonement healing was strong. It felt like it covered all of my AoE healing needs without having to revert to direct spam heal kind of situations like Disc used to have to do quite often with Shadow Mend. Is that once incoming damage kind of overwhelmed Atonement throughput, you reverted to just spamming Shadow Mend. I feel like Atonement is strong enough now that isn't really necessary, or it doesn't feel necessary. This can feel like a little bit of a power word shield bot. In some dungeons, especially ones without a lot of group-wide AoE healing, Power Word Shield is just going to be like 40% of your overall healing. It's crazy strong. I think I crit a 200k Power Word Shield on a Blood DK. I've crit myself or just normal targets for over 150k multiple times this weekend, which is pretty crazy when it's basically 100% of someone's health bar. And that's without gaming it with the set bonus. So you can get even higher numbers. If you're really trying to stack the buffs, you can get that higher, but yeah, just through regular gameplay, I was critting for effectively 100% of people's health bars on a single Power Word Shield. In one of the keys I played as Disc, I ended up having to use Power Word Shield on the tank every single time because he was just taking a lot of damage. But then I did another dungeon with a different tank who really didn't need much healing or babysitting at all. And in that situation, Power Word Shield just felt like an ungodly powerful triage healing button. Anyone takes any damage, you can just instantly stop their health bar moving every 6 seconds. It felt really strong, probably a little bit too strong. And also, I think a little bit imbalanced for the overall toolkit because pressing Flash Heal and Renew felt like they just did absolutely nothing. I would probably like to see some of that Power Word Shield power be toned down and instead pushed into the Flash Heal side of the spec. Also had a few times where I crit 200k plus Holy Words, which again is just someone's entire health bar. Holy Word Life, sorry. And that's on, I believe, an 8-second cooldown. 10-second cooldown, which is just, it's very nice emergency healing to have on such a short cooldown. As far as button bloat goes, which I mentioned in my disc overview, and Blizzard alluded to in their blue post, it's definitely still there. Especially with Flash Heal now applying Atonement to the Priest or the caster. When you have, I think it's called Binding Heal, talented on the class tree, I really didn't find any reason to press Renew. And I also found myself in many situations where I would either leave abilities off cooldown that shouldn't be because I had so many other buttons to press, things like Divine Star or Prayer of Mending, because of the button bloat. Oh, and I also found myself not pressing Smite sometimes over extended periods of time. I could go a whole trash pack 20-30 seconds without having to press Smite at all because I always had better buttons to press. Now, that isn't a bad thing at all, but like I said with the button bloat, Discipline now feels like it definitely has more GCDs than it really knows what to do with, or more options for GCDs. It feels like you can never quite fit in all the spells you want to fit in. Overall Discipline damage is a little low. It's not too bad, maybe 20-30% lower than Preservation can pull or Mistweaver. And I think this is mainly down to them lacking a good AoE filler or burst cooldown. Holy Nova just doesn't really cut it, and losing Mind Seer sucks a little bit, especially because you have to be in melee range for Holy Nova, which just, it isn't always practical, and it isn't always, it's just sometimes you don't want to give up good positioning to go and do a little bit of damage. Overall, the Discipline feels quite good. I know in my overall tier list of healers, I rank Discipline and Holy below Resto Druid, Resto Shaman, and Mistweaver. I think I would actually kind of bump those up. At least throughput-wise at the moment, both of those specs feel really good. That overall, they perform quite well, which I guess leads me into Holy Priest. Holy Priest is one of those specs that does good throughput without having to do very much. And that's mostly through your short-term cooldowns and things like Prayer of Mending. So oftentimes, you can heal, especially with coordinated groups, you could probably heal most keys most of the time without really ever having to revert to the flash heal kind of old flash concentration playstyle of spamming spells. And you can spend a good portion of your time doing damage, which at the moment feels quite good. And that's because, like I said, the throughput from their short-term cooldowns is really quite strong. Power Word Shield is strong, Holy Word Life is strong, Prayer of Mending, Circle of Healing. They have a lot of, 10, 15 second cooldown buttons to press, which just do a lot of work. When that sort of maintenance healing style isn't sufficient, you really just revert to spamming flash heal and heal, which is okay. And I can see Holy Priests, especially in good or like well coordinated groups, being able to drop some of the throughput options on the talent tree, take the damage nodes instead. And I can see them like really pumping the meters with those options. As I played it this weekend, I took Lightweaver and I went for the extra cooldowns or the double charges on Holy Words. And those two capstones along with the Prayer of Mending nodes means you don't have enough points to take good AoE healing, so you can't take Prayer of Healing or the associated talents, can't take damage nodes, that you just don't have enough points. But like I said, I could see myself dropping some of those throughput nodes to take the talent nodes. And in good groups, I could see Holy being very competitive. Holy Word's Serenity being effectively like pretty much a 1 minute cooldown, and all it does is 2 heals worth of healing. Feels a little weak, but Lightweaver feels great. It does a lot of work. It saves your mana bar very effectively when you really do have to pump a lot of throughput. It doesn't feel like you're burning through your mana bar like a Mistweaver does when you cast a lot of spells. Like I said, Holy Priest damage is quite low, but that's because I didn't have the damage talents. I think Holy Priest has the second, it'd probably be tied with Resto Druid for the second highest throughput for this weekend. There were times where I could burst 40-45k HPS on a Holy Priest. It did require some cooldowns, but it was possible. It didn't ever feel like I was in trouble on a Holy Priest. I felt like I always had the buttons and the cooldowns ready to go. My positioning wasn't too important or overly important. Mobility felt a little bit lacking, especially with the need to marry up to partners to drop the Thundering debuffs. But overall, Holy Priest felt really quite strong. Next up will be Holy Paladin. I would probably put Holy Paladin as the worst healer for me this weekend. That's not to say it's bad. I just felt it was a little lacking compared to the other healers for the content I was doing in the situation I was playing. That is pugged groups, learning mechanics, not having routes written down in stone, and groups figuring out mechanics and people making mistakes and that kind of thing. I think Holy Paladin really excels when you're in a very coordinated group. You know exactly when you're using your cooldowns, and you know exactly what cooldowns you need for which packs. And in situations where you're just trying to do the most damage and bring good utility, and your overall throughput isn't a huge game breaker, I feel like Holy Paladin really excels in Mythic Plus in that situation. But for this weekend, it wasn't great. I felt that my throughput was almost entirely dependent on cooldowns or procs. And when you're learning dungeons and people are making mistakes and you haven't got your routes down or anything like that, it was a real burden playing Holy Paladin for me. When I had my cooldowns up, I didn't feel like Holy Paladin's throughput was anything exceptional. If anything, I felt like with wings up, it felt on par almost with, you know, Preservation, Mistweaver, basically every other healer without cooldowns. One of the major pain points for this weekend was just being in melee. Unfortunately, at least for me, I'm definitely a ranged player, and being in melee on a Holy Paladin just felt horrible, more than it felt good. There were many times where being stacked together or clumped together for a lot of the AoE spell kind of effects, the spread mechanics and things that went out just felt horrible. There are a lot of times when mobs or bosses were standing on fire on the ground so I couldn't hit them. There were a lot of frontal cones and stack mechanics and spread mechanics, and even things like if you stack close enough to other melee or the tank or anyone else, when the thundering buffs come out, you can instantly remove them. So I guess I'll just say I would not want to play a Holy Paladin in a group with a lot of other melee, especially in something like Azure Vaults. I mean, Ruby Life Pools was bad enough, and that wasn't overly melee unfriendly, but it certainly had a few mechanics that were punishing to melee. Mana on Holy Paladin felt absolutely fine. I don't think my mana bar really moved. And this is talking about Holy Paladin playing the melee version. Honestly, at least at the moment, while everyone's learning mechanics, I cannot even imagine playing a caster Holy Paladin. I just don't see how trying to get the majority of your healing out of Flash Heal or Holy Light would be viable in as Mythic Plus stands at the moment. A lot of people take very bursty damage. Tanks oftentimes need some serious babysitting. There's a lot of casters and like magic damage and things like that. So even the specs that would be quite tanky can just fall over very quickly. Damage for Holy Paladin was also very lacking. That could be my inexperience with Holy Paladin. All I was really doing was keeping Consecration down, using Judgment on cooldown, and if I had excess Holy Power, which I often didn't, especially on the packs that required cooldowns, like the big packs, the ones that you want to kill quickly, I didn't have the spare Holy Power to be dropping Shield of the Righteous on them. So my damage was quite low, probably the lowest of any healer this weekend. I also had serious problems with a couple of packs that were back-to-back difficult. I can imagine this won't be as bad with more coordinated groups, but even something like Ruby Life Pools, if the tank does a big pull leading up to the dragons, the single dragons that you have to kill, and you want to use your cooldowns for that big pull, and then you don't have them up for the dragon, you're gonna, like, we had trouble. I think we wiped 3 or 4 times to one dragon, because if I didn't have wings up and I didn't have procs, people just died too quickly. There was a lot of damage going out and I just didn't have the buttons available to really move health bars. And again, leading up to the final boss, there's a few packs of mobs that have a caster in them, and the caster does the pulsing thunder party-wide raid damage. And as an example, maybe on the first pack with that, if I pop my cooldowns like wings, then I could be fine. My healing was okay. We'd get through it. And then we'd pull the next pack and I wouldn't have wings up. So it was a little bit hit or miss. This could have been partly down to sloppy play or like a poorly coordinated or poorly played group that soaked a lot of damage mechanics. But I will say, out of the whole weekend, most of my groups I pugged with there were mistakes in every keys. I think every single key bar one had multiple deaths. There was just a lot of instances of people learning mechanics and failing mechanics. And Holy Paladin, I felt, definitely struggled in that scenario more than any other healer. As far as Resto Druid goes, the healer I put at the top of the list in my healer tier list, I think it still keeps that spot. I also think it'll still get some class talent tree adjustments to remove the 3-point nodes and maybe clean up a few pathing issues, which would really, I think, put Resto Druid solidly in S tier. Its utility felt great. Its healing, its raw throughput was very high. I didn't feel like I had any problems healing any packs, and I really wasn't worried or thinking about certain cooldowns or upcoming mechanics or anything. I just kind of relaxed on Druid. Same with Resto Shaman, actually. Very high on-demand burst throughput can really get you through a lot of situations. And I burnt through a little bit of mana on Resto Druid, but I also, again, I just wasn't thinking about mana. I wasn't worried about it. I wasn't trying to get the best out of my regrowth, clear casting procs, and I wasn't trying to avoid pressing wild growth if I could manage it. I was just pressing buttons, moving health bars. It was really quite a breeze. Resto Druid is very, very strong right now, I would say. Its damage is a little bit low, but also I wasn't cat weaving, which in a really like well-performing, well-coordinated group, and if I felt like I had the globals to do that, it could probably do quite competitive damage. It's just I wasn't playing it in that situation. The heavy lifting for throughput in small scale content at the moment is definitely the Life Bloom nodes for me on the left side of the spec tree. I think out of the 3 Resto Druid keys I did, Life Bloom was my top overall healing in every key. And not having to spam regrowth to move health bars felt great. I had a lot of fun on Resto Druid. Excellent healer. It's got a lot of options, a lot of different talent options. Its cooldowns are great. Its burst healing is great. Its sustained healing is great. Its stacked healing is good. Its spread healing is good. It was really fun. It was definitely the easiest healer I played all weekend. Resto Shaman honestly wasn't far behind Druid. Resto Shaman throughput feels very high, especially for what Resto Shamans usually have, which historically I would say Resto Shamans have been the spec that brought more utility rather than throughput, but at the moment in Dragonflight it feels like they bring both. Having Chain Heal added to Tidal Waves, being able to take things like Cloudburst Totem and Flash Flood at the same time. The recent buff to Earth Living Weapon, 250%, things like that. And the normal Riptide nodes on the talent tree just doing a lot of work. Resto Shaman, honestly, it just felt great. I think I healed 2 or 3 keys as Resto Shaman, didn't have to press a single cooldown. I basically just pressed Riptide, a few chain heals for the party-wide damage situations, and then just spam damage all day. It was really quite almost relaxing. It's very easy. Like I said, throughput's very high, utility is very high. Having your AoE stuns and your short cooldown interrupt and slows and roots and all that kind of stuff just felt really good. Resto Shaman damage was probably a little bit low, but that's me comparing it to Mistweaver that probably does the most out of all healers. Preservation not far behind that. The reason I pointed out is because I actually felt like Resto Shaman was the healer I had the most free globals on. Riptide was just doing so much work, and knowing that there was almost always a Riptide ready to be cast whenever health bars started moving or people took damage or stood in the fire or something, it just meant that a lot of the time I could just spam Chain Lightning all dungeon. I could have Acid Rain, Healing Rain down on every pack. I could do all those things and spend a lot of time DPSing and still do good throughput and bring good utility, not have to worry about my mana bar at all. Mobility was really quite good, especially with gusts of wind. But even with all of that playing out in that way, my damage was still lower than I would have expected for how many globals I had free to spend on damaging abilities. But overall, I would say I would put Resto Shaman and Disc and probably Holy as a triple tie for the second easiest healers I played all weekend. And last but not least, Mistweaver. Mistweaver feels almost like I'm playing 2 different specs. So the general fist weaving Mistweaver, the ancient teachings and the Phalanx Stomp kind of Mistweaver that everyone's very hyped about, and rightfully so, feels fantastic. Its damage is crazy high. It's the highest of any healer, I think, for Mythic Plus, especially on like packs or in cleave situations. Its healing throughput is huge. Its utility is great. It has good cooldowns. It's really fun. It's fantastic. I have really nothing bad to say about it. Your mana bar doesn't move. Just your screen fills up with damage numbers and everyone's health bars bounce back up to full. Feels great. I have, like I said, nothing bad to say about that aspect of the gameplay. The problem I have with Mistweaver is that fist weaving style isn't viable on bosses or single targets. Basically, any situation in which you can't cleave mobs, fist weaving ceases to be viable, which feels not great. And then again, fist weaving has effectively the same problem Holy Paladin has, and that's just being in melee. Some people are probably going to be fine with that, and they're going to be excellent at moving and spamming their buttons at the same time and all that kind of stuff. And it won't be as big a problem for them, but I'm definitely a range player, and there were a lot of times this week where I just hated being in melee, or I couldn't be in melee. I wanted to be. So I actually tested Mistweavers the most this whole weekend. I think I did 6 keys on Mistweaver, and I did a few as a pure fist weaving, the normal build, and then I did a couple trying out a more caster focused build. And the idea was to see if the caster build felt better predominantly on bosses. And I would say, unfortunately, both variations felt bad on bosses. The caster build burned through so much mana that it was the only healer the entire weekend that I even looked at like eating on my mana bar or worried about going which is a little unfortunate. It's not great to see that the pure fist weaving version of Mistweaver does not spend mana, and then the casting version of Mistweaver spends so much mana that it's almost not viable. Look, if I was playing with groups that were well practiced and well coordinated and excellent players who never took avoidable damage, always used defensives well, then no, I don't think any version of Mistweaver or any healer for that matter would really have mana problems, at least at the moment. In 10, 11, 12 keys, most of the time bosses are dying in 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes 30. I don't think any healer really is going to have issues with their mana bar on those kind of situations, especially if the group plays well. But there were a lot of situations this week where people just took damage, they stood in stuff on every single pack, and there were situations where I could walk into a literal room in like Ruby Life Pools, for example, that has maybe 3 different pools or 3 different packs, and I could burn through 100% of my mana bar in 3 packs on Mistweaver. Now, I don't think even if I tried, I could spend as much mana on any other healer, but on Mistweaver, you definitely can. Now, the buff to Ancient Teachings to increase the range to 30 yards is quite noticeable, and it's a definite step in the right direction. The real deciding factor at the moment for me, for Mistweaver, is just that your cleave healing is so high and your single target healing is so low that I would really like to see Blizzard nerf the damage or the healing or whatever on the stacked cleave situation and buff it back on single target. I can honestly see situations in which Mistweavers are just not viable in high tyrannical. Maybe I'm missing something here, but at least from this week's testing, I have no clue how any Mistweaver is going to heal, for example, the last boss in Ruby Life Pools. If that's a boss fight that requires serious throughput, because it has a lot of unavoidable party-wide damage, there is fire all over the floor all the time. The boss is moving around all the time. Your group is moving around all the time. You have debuffs going out, tanks to dispel. There's a lot of mana to spend at all times and a lot of damage going out on your party at all times. And I just don't see how a Mistweaver is ever going to heal a boss fight like that if that fight requires serious throughput and it lasts, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes in a high tyrannical key. Now, as I guess, just as a way to use this as an example, and obviously different groups are difficult to compare apples to apples, but for all of my keys this week, I averaged somewhere between 15 and 25k overall HPS, depending on how sloppy the group was or how many times you wiped or things like that. For the most part, most of them about 20k overall. And that last boss in Ruby Life Pools, I think every single dungeon I averaged about 25k on that last boss, maybe 30 on some of them. And as an example, I could do 30k HPS on Resto Shaman, Resto Druid, Disc Priest, Holy Priest, even Preservation without really using my mana at all. I don't think any of those healers in that situation would drop below 80% mana. Whereas I could do the same healing or 30k HPS over let's say a 2 minute, minute 45 to 2 minute period for that boss, and I could burn through my entire mana bar. Overall, I'd still say Mistweaver is really quite strong, and if people figure out good ways to deal with the kind of like the boss fight healing situation for Mistweavers, then Mistweavers will be very, very strong and very competitive. It's just they have that one speed bump to kind of tackle at the moment to see what happens with balancing or the hotfixes in the early weeks of Dragonflight to see how any of this changes. But after this week overall, I would even go back to my healer tier list and I would clump them all slightly closer together. It's going to sound like I have a lot of criticisms for a lot of different specs for different reasons, but overall, they're all really quite fun and they're all definitely viable, especially when played by people who are just better at them than me. And I don't want people to go away from this video thinking that, Resto Druids are absolutely amazing and Holy Paladins are dog shit. They're quite good. There's just a couple of healers have issues that the other healers don't have. And they're not huge, game-breaking, non-viable issues. They're really quite small in the grand scheme of things. And as we get to test different dungeons and take keys higher, all of these opinions might even change again in the future. And obviously tuning is still ongoing, so we'll see how all of that works out. But anyway, I think that's enough rambling for me. So thanks, and algorithm stuff.